episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
And also by pelvic health professionals. I am so excited, Connected Yoga teachers, because the doors are open and you can come on over and learn all you need to know, all of the up-to-date information about pelvic health and how you can share this with your yoga students. Inside of Pelvic Health Professionals, we have a comprehensive and current library of information. We have monthly guest speaker calls. There's an 8-hour Yoga for Pelvic Health training included in there, which is a $379 value on its own. We have live monthly Q&A calls and also an interactive and supportive community. We're really passionate about connecting yoga teachers, movement professionals, PTs, anyone who's working with individuals with a pelvis, connecting them to the information, the newest and most up-to-date information in the pelvic health world. And one of the topics that comes up all the time is anything about the bladder or urinary incontinence. And today, I'm really excited to talk to you about why we need to know this as yoga teachers. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I'm a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, and a trainer and consultant who works for yoga teachers. And this podcast was created for you so that you can connect to the information and inspiration each and every week and feel supported as you navigate these sometimes very tricky jungles of being a yoga teacher and also being a business owner. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the basics of the bladder and also how many of our yoga students are dealing with the embarrassment or isolation that lack of bladder control or incontinence is causing for them. Urinary incontinence affects 300 million people worldwide. And while this is a really common issue that many people, particularly female-bodied people and those over the age of 60 struggle with, it's not normal. It's not something you have to live with. It's not something that happens after you have children or as you age, and then it's just part of life. It is not that. It is common, but it is not normal. I have found over the years in working with many students who deal with urinary incontinence that yoga can be so beneficial. And there are a couple of sides to this. So not only is the yoga and the connection to the nervous system beneficial and the movement and the breath, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but also the awareness and the education around how the bladder actually works is so empowering to people. To illustrate this, let me share a study that was done. In 2014, researchers from the UCSF School of Medicine led a study, and I'll make sure that I link to it in our show notes. This study looked at the effects of yoga on incontinence. And I actually wrote about this study as well in an article that I shared on Yoga Anytime. So I'll make sure to link to that article as well. And I will also include a coupon code so that you can do 30 days of yoga with me on Yoga Anytime that's focused on pelvic health if you're interested in that. Okay, so in this study, there were 19 women who were enrolled in the study who had been dealing with urinary incontinence issues for at least 3 months. Half of the women did a 6-week yoga program, while the other half didn't do that yoga. Those women who were in the yoga group, they saw a definite reduction. It was a 66% reduction in the frequency of urine leakage, while the non-yoga group saw a 13% improvement. So this study, I remember reading it first and thinking, yay, like there's a small study, it is a very small study, showing that yoga does help with urinary incontinence. But I got super curious about what happened with the non-yoga group. What improved things for that group of people? It's important to note in this study that each participant was given a pamphlet outlining standard behavioral self-management strategies for improving bladder control. This highlights how empowering education and understanding the bladder is. This outlines why it is important that we as yoga teachers understand this really important organ in the body. Now, we are for sure not diagnosing urinary incontinence. We are referring to the pelvic health professionals like the PTs, those physiotherapists or physical therapists who specialize in urinary incontinence. But the really important thing here to note is that so many PTs who specialize in pelvic health have come to connect with me to say, you know what? These people who are dealing with urinary incontinence are showing up in your yoga classes. We know that it's at least 1 in 4 women and at least 1 in 9 men who deal with urinary incontinence. Studies are actually showing us it's more like 50% of people deal with some type of urinary incontinence in their life. So a couple of questions here. How does yoga help the bladder? How does it have an impact on the bladder? And what can we do in our yoga classes to give our students some basic information about their bladder in case they are silently dealing with urinary incontinence and feeling like they can't do anything about it? Before we dive into these 2 questions, I want to give a shout out of thank you to our sponsor, Schedulicity. Let's hear our hot tip of the week from the team over there.
Hey Connected Yoga teachers, this is Anna with the Schedulicity Hot Tip of the Week. Schedulicity is pleased to present improvements to our class booking feature. We worked with yoga businesses to find out what they really needed to make their business more successful and less stressful. Together, we developed group booking, online waivers, waitlists, and client alerts to help you manage the needs of your students and grow as a business. If you've been wondering how an online scheduler can help you specifically as a business, we'd love to tell you more. Email us anytime at support@schedulicity.com or visit schedulicity.com for more information and a chat with one of our support rockstars.
Thank you so much, Team Schedulicity. And I also want to say a thank you to Gretchen Shute, who posted something and I asked for permission to share this. Gretchen said, I'm catching up on listening to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast, and I just listened to episode 176 with Jessica Stansberry on email strategy. It motivated me to map out a 75%/25% plan for my newsletter. This will make so much more sense, dear listener, if you go back and have a listen to episode 176. Gretchen goes on to say, I wrote out the Monday dates for the balance of the year and alternated content topics per week. And then she goes on to say, mindful movement tip, essential oil blend recipe, breathing practice, and a personal share promo. Structure is one of my core values, and this feels so good. Thank you, Shannon and Jessica. Gretchen, I love this so much. I love that when you had to listen to that episode with Jessica, you felt like you could really take action, sit down, and make a plan. I have gotten a lot of feedback about that episode, that it has helped so many of our yoga teachers see the importance and value that email can have in your business. Okay, let's dive back into this important topic of understanding the bladder and how this can affect our yoga students. So there are 3 categories of urinary incontinence. There's stress incontinence, urge incontinence, and mixed incontinence. So just to clarify, even though the word stress is in there, it's not meaning like stress on our nervous system, although that can affect the bladder. Stress incontinence is when we leak during a laugh, jump, orgasm, sneeze, or cough. Urge incontinence is when you feel the need to go to the bathroom immediately. So sometimes this can be right when you go to put your key in the lock in the door, or maybe when you get out of your car and you're walking towards your house. There's some trigger for the brain to say, okay, this is our routine. I need to go to the bathroom right now. And mixed incontinence is a combination of both stress and urge incontinence. Now, here's a really cool thing. If as I'm talking about this, you feel like, oh goodness, I'm having the urge to go to the bathroom, or if you ever deal with urge incontinence, try something out for a moment. Try slowing your breath down. Try telling yourself it's okay. Like, can you come into this meditative state, even if you're standing, And also try doing some heel pumps. So from standing, try lifting one heel, press that heel down into the earth, and lift the other one and press that one down into the earth. What is so amazing is there's a real connection to a nerve that connects with our calf muscle and goes all the way to the bladder. So sometimes you hear people say, when I step outside into the cold, that's when I feel like I really need to go to the bathroom. This is that connection. Many of you know that I've been dealing with a herniated disc, and it's at my L4, L5, and the doctors have all been asking me along the way, 1, do you have foot drop? And 2, are you losing control of your bladder? And this is because our nerves and our spine and the nerves that radiate from the spine there have a real connection with the bladder. We go into more detail about these topics inside of the Pelvic Health Professionals membership, but I wanted to grab a couple of things from what I remember from those guest speakers who focused on urinary incontinence. I'll put a link in our show notes so that you can see all of our guest speakers and the topics that they have covered. One of them is urinary incontinence with Sarah Haig. Sarah is the author of a book called Understanding and Treating Incontinence: What Causes Urinary Incontinence and How to Regain Bladder Control. She is a physiotherapist who specializes in pelvic health and really helps a lot of people who are dealing with urinary incontinence. So we talked about all kinds of things in that guest speaker call, and if you're wanting to dive in and just get learning more about it, you can head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com and click on the join button and dive right in and have a listen and grab all of the resources. But one thing that really related in this call to yoga and the bladder is a question that came in from one of our members around the role of the nervous system in incontinence. Sarah outlined that the bladder will retain about 50 to 75 milliliters of urine. So if we're running around and we're really busy and we almost feel like we don't have time to go to the bathroom and fully relax and empty the bladder, that this can be an issue. So Sarah was talking about how she recommends often to people to really take some breaths there, to allow the pelvic floor to really relax and take the time to focus on the urination as it happens. Sometimes we're just thinking, okay, I need to go to the washroom really quickly and then get back to this busy thing that I'm doing. And this is one of the things that we as yoga teachers help our students with. We help them come into an awareness. We help them come into the moment. And we also help them to understand the difference of holding tension in muscles and finding that relaxation. Another thing that came up in this call, and that comes up so often in many of our guest speaker calls, is talking about the pelvic floor and the muscles of the pelvic floor, because oftentimes the misconception is that if you're experiencing urinary incontinence, the answer is Kegels or Kegels, however you like to say it. But we know, and we're really beginning to understand, that a lot of the time urinary incontinence can also be caused by a pelvic floor that is holding too much tension. So if you think of the pelvic floor like a trampoline that provides support for the bladder, and think about what makes a trampoline effective. So if it is too tight, you're just not going to have that movement that's required for an effective trampoline. And the same is true for your pelvic floor. We want the muscles of the pelvic floor to activate when they're needed, but we also want them to release and relax at the appropriate times. So this is where things like restorative yoga or yoga that really gets into that restorative aspect or that relaxation response aspect really helps our yoga students. So we might also be looking at tools like pranayama, meditation, and gentle yoga. These can all activate the parasympathetic, that rest and digest nervous system. This is one of the tools that you can share with your yoga students, and it is only going to add benefit to them. There's no way that if someone is dealing with urge incontinence, you can suggest to them, if they came to you and told you in a class, which a lot of the time our students are not going to do, or maybe you're hosting a class and you can talk about the bladder, you can focus on the bladder and say that one thing that might help the bladder is anything that will bring us into that relaxation response. As a total side note here, and as an add-on, if you are going to start talking about the bladder in one of your yoga classes, I highly recommend finding out who the pelvic health PTs in your area are and having their cards there just so people can pick them up at the end of the class. This is how things started when I started focusing on yoga for pelvic health. I started talking about the bladder here and there in different various group classes, and I made sure that I had those cards. And that was actually what got me thinking, oh my gosh, my students really need this, in the amount of cards that were taken at the end of the class. Another thing that we focus on all the time as yoga teachers is our alignment and our posture. And a great visual for this is bring one hand up towards your sternum, and that represents your diaphragm. Bring the other hand down towards the pelvis. That's going to represent the pelvic floor. So we know that on the inhale, pelvic floor and diaphragm soften and move down a little bit. And on the exhale, they move up a little bit. And this is just really natural movement. We don't have to force it to happen. But see what it's like to stand or to sit tall in this with your hands there, and imagine the breath happening. Now hunch forward and curl in, and then just notice, what would it be like for the diaphragm and the pelvic floor to move now? Now we definitely, quote unquote, hunch forward or curl forward many times in our day, and we shouldn't be afraid of this movement. But this might give some indication if all day long we were sitting at a computer and we were curled forward. Something else I like to bring in here is the awareness of the rib cage. So when we are, sitting tall, we can imagine expanding at the rib cage on the inhale all the way around. And on the exhale, allowing that rib cage to come back to center. Recently, I went to visit my PT and she said, "Shannon, are you working on your breathing?" And I was like, with all that I've been dealing with my herniated disc, I was kind of forgetting, to take that rib cage breath. And she said, this is really interesting because she knows me quite well and she knows that I practice yoga and she knows how my body generally works. She said, I think from the pain that you've been dealing with, your diaphragm is really kind of hiding up underneath your rib cage and not wanting to do as much movement as it usually is. So see what that's like right now to try and move the rib cage. Even if you hold on to the rib cage or bring a yoga belt around the rib cage, this can really help with that awareness and that movement of diaphragm and pelvic floor. Last week on the podcast, I talked more about the benefits of this. And so you can go back and have a listen to learn more about the pelvic floor and how that really impacts our pelvic health. Another thing that we do in our yoga classes a lot of the time is strengthening. So during yoga, you can work to activate and strengthen your true inner core. So at the bottom of that core four is the pelvic floor. At the top is the diaphragm. We also have the transversus abdominis muscles that wrap around and the multifidus muscles that go along the spine. We talked in another episode about the core, what's included in that core. I like to talk about the core four, but let's not also forget about the glutes and the psoas muscles. Those big supporting muscles that can really sometimes be taking a break or sometimes be a little overactive in the body. Everything, we want to think of it as working synergistically and working together. Another important thing that we bring to our yoga students that can help them with their bladder health is awareness. Building that awareness in the body can have such a huge impact. Now, there were some new guidelines released this year around urinary incontinence, and we were really lucky to talk to Dr. Sinead Dufour and Dr. Carolyn Best about these guidelines that were just released. That's inside of our membership. Again, you can go and listen to that entire talk and also have access to the new guidelines that were released. But one of our members, Marit, asked them, what do you wish people would know about stress or urge incontinence? Dr. Sinead Dufour said that we really need to look at developing our fitness capacity, and the pelvic floor seems to help both. Balance in yoga, muscular control, balancing out the nervous system, all of these elements really seem to help people who are dealing with urinary incontinence. Dr. Carolyn Best went on to say it's about relaxation as much as strengthening, and yoga really helps to address both of those things. Now, if you want to go on to learn more about stress incontinence, we talked to Melissa DeSalles, who's a physiotherapist based out of Canada. Melissa explained the difference between stress and urge incontinence and why this leaking might occur and how yoga can address some of these issues. So I'll make sure to link back to that episode with Melissa. That's episode 148. Another episode to have a listen to, and I'll make sure that I link to it in the show notes, is episode 151 if you're working with male yoga students. So Dr. Susie Gronsky focuses on male pelvic health, and that was episode 151. And way back in the podcast, in episode 9, Shelley Prosko talked to us about Kegels versus Mula Bandha. What's the difference? What are the similarities? Basically, that pelvic floor contraction. Do we need to be telling our students to do Kegels during yoga class? Do we need to be cueing Mula Bandha? What are the things that we need to know if we are going to cue that pelvic floor contraction? Another episode that goes along really well with this is the episode that we did with MJ Forget, where she talked about the pelvic floor tension versus weakness. That's the episode of Anatomy of the Pelvic Floor. All of those will be in the show notes for you. So if you want to dive in and learn more, we have lots of podcast episodes to help you to do that. As a summary or a recap, there are so many tools that you as a yoga teacher are already sharing with your yoga students that help them to deal with urinary incontinence. So this benefit might be happening without your yoga students even talking to you about what's going on with them. Personally, I like to talk about the bladder like any other part of the body. I think that education is empowering. I think that when we understand how the bladder works, we can really empower our students to build that awareness and also to reach out for help. So that'd be the second key takeaway here, is to have that referral ready to go. Have that pelvic health PT in your area who specializes in helping people who are dealing with incontinence. It's really important to understand that relaxation is just as effective sometimes, if not more, than strengthening. So the answer is not to do Kegels. That's not the answer for incontinence. It really depends. And it's not up to us as yoga teachers to know what people need. We can focus on that relaxation response, inform our students how to relax the pelvic floor as well, and leave the Kegel homework up to the PTs who can check, is that person doing Kegels properly? I've learned over the years that the one time that it's helpful for me to cue a pelvic floor contraction in my yoga classes is like we would if, let's say, you squeeze your fists together and find that contraction of all of the muscles in the hands, and then release and notice that relaxation. Notice the difference of that tension and holding that tension and then releasing and relaxing. Yoga students love when I start talking about urinary incontinence and the tips and tools that we can use. I see them really start to pay attention at that time. I bring them up to stand. As I said, I love to do those heel pumps. If you want to see the entire flow that I do for urinary incontinence, it's over on Yoga Anytime. So you can do it. You can try it out. You can show your students, share it with them. I would love to hear how this information lands with you, what questions you have going forward, and what you've learned today in this Bladder 101 for yoga teachers. If you are someone who's dealing with urinary incontinence, you are not alone. It is just so important to ask for help. I know too many people who have been dealing with urinary incontinence for years finally go see a pelvic health PT and wish that they would have done it so much sooner. You definitely can try yoga and try different things, and you'll know if it's working. You know when that incontinence decreases or stops. If it's increasing from something that you're doing, then you know, okay, let's try and change that or take that away for a moment and see how I can do something different. I also wanted to say how much I appreciate your time of being here. I feel like you can't chat with everyone about bladder and urinary incontinence, and it's fun to think that we're just kind of having this chit chat. And my hope is that you'll find something today that really impacts your own awareness about your own body or impacts how you teach your yoga students. So thank you so much for hanging out here. I know you have lots of things that you could be doing today. I also want to say a thank you to our team, Suzanne, Crunch, Nick, and Sinead, for doing so much work behind the scenes. And before I sign off, I want to ask you, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?